Hello everyone, welcome back to the Grim Dawn class examination. This is your host, Professor Reha, here with the Defiler, which is the combination of the Demolitionist and the Necromancer. Now, this is a rough combination to combine if you don't have specific items, because there is absolutely zero crossover in damage here. Well, I can't say zero. There is a little, but there's not a whole lot. There's very, very little coordination going on here, which does somewhat negatively affect your ability to deal early damage, especially since, unfortunately, a lot of the equipment that really can help out this class, unfortunately, tends to happen over level 50, past level 50. So it can get quite difficult for you to maintain consistent damage output in the early to mid levels, because you're not going to have the equipment that's going to allow you to effectively play this. Essentially, before level 50, I mean, there's a couple of pieces of equipment between 30 and 40 that can help this combination out. There's a very commonly dropped scythe, two-handed axe, that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head that's for this combination, and that's fairly effective. But beyond that, it's an extremely rough time. So for the most part, when you play this particular class, you're going to be focusing on one of the two very specifically, with maybe a little bit of splash over in the other one, but for the most part, there's going to be very little of you pulling from both of them simultaneously. You're going to be basically picking your favorite one of the two, and pretty much solo building that until at least level 30. You're pretty much going to pretend you have only a single class. Actually, you can build just only a single class if you're more comfortable with that, until you get what you need to make this work. But I'm going to actually, first off, just talk about the skills that you will universally want to think about, or at least consider in some way. For Demolitionist, this actually will wind up being, of course, Fire Strike. This surprises absolutely no one. No one's surprised. Granado, and Mortar Trap. Now, the Mortar Trap may surprise some people, but really, when you're talking about Demolitionist, the main thing here is that you can potentially get some benefit to your Demolitionist class with the physical resistance reduction from Spectral Wrath, and then splash in Vitality and Aether damage as you like. Actually, the functional point of Spectral Wrath, which, by the way, happens to be one of the 3 skills that you should always consider for this combination, the pleasant thing about Spectral Wrath is no matter what damage type your equipment eventually converts one of the other skill to, Spectral Wrath will be able to increase how much damage it's doing, which is very effective. So this overall works very well. Furthermore, even if you're focusing on physical damage, simply having Spectral Wrath will give you free Vitality and Aether damage that you can splash in for those physical resistant enemies, of which there are several. So this really does help out pretty much any Demolitionist class. Even if you're only pulling Spectral Wrath out of this, it still can very much be worth it. Another skill that you will always want to be considering here will be Reaping Strike. Again, this mostly has to do, and actually I'm just going to go ahead and say Necrotic Edge for the same reason. These both pull whatever damage from your weapon you're using, so as long as you're extremely careful about what weapon you're utilizing, Reaping Strike and Necrotic Edge can in fact benefit from fire damage increases, lightning damage increases, physical damage increases, whatever you happen to be looking to do with the Demolitionist side of this class. So these two and Spectral Wrath, and there have been builds where I've only built these out of here, and then the rest of it's been pure Demolitionist. These also coordinate really well with Fire Strike, for reference, so that's potentially quite potent. That's just a wonderful, good time. So, really, there's not a whole lot to unfortunately talk about with this combination without getting into items, which this particular portion of the series is avoiding. We're not really going to heavily talk about items, other than noting that items are pretty much how this particular class flows better. It's how it synergizes the Demolitionist and the Necromancer in new ways, because without itemization, there's extremely little actual coordination between the two classes. You can go into Hellfire Mine, that might work, and in fact, I've seen this work occasionally very well. It's not a bad idea. You can absolutely pull off Hellfire Mine and also go into Seer Souls, converting all of this vitality damage into Aether damage instead. Go into Blood Boil if you're really dedicated to it. That's entirely up to you. It's not like you can enhance the bleeding or vitality decay damage here. I mean, at this point, you're converting it into Aether damage anyways. But yes, Hellfire Mine would increase Seer Souls, or Siphon Souls, which would be incredibly potent. Furthermore, it could also boost Drain Essence. Now, an interesting thing that not a lot of people, once again, talk about very heavily is that we can convert that Aether damage to cold damage on the off chance you only wanted Thermite Mine, because Thermite Mine reduces elemental resistance across the board. So, a fairly interesting idea, if you didn't want to dedicate your way all the way to Hellfire Mine, is you could go into Thermite Mine, go all the way up to Static Strike, go into Flame Touched, convert Granado using Skyfire Granado, and then go into Canister Bomb, convert this, and then you're pretty much golden here. Because now you're doing all of this Fire and Lightning, plus the cold damage from Drain Essence. Remove this for a hot second. And if you were really dedicated, you could go into Bone Harvest and Dread. If you wanted to. That's purely up to you, but it can work. So that's something that you can think about. Like I said, there are a couple of avenues that you can go into if you want to be boosting your damage across items. You could also, of course, go into the Mortar Trap for some lightning damage here, and more fire damage, obviously. But you could just use Thermite Mine and actually pull in all three elements for some very interesting elemental damage and boost all three of these elements. Or, like I said, you could go into Hellfire Mine, go into Seer Souls, leave this as Aether damage if you want to, or not. This does boost your damage output by 25%, which is very impressive, by the way. And you can run with that. So you do have a couple of options. If you are going to run Hellfire Mine, you will be looking to get Brimstone and Agonizing Flames. You will probably be looking for a two-handed ranged weapon, probably. Should you be restricted to this? Heavens no. Please don't take my words as absolute gospel. These are just cool things that I've uncovered from playing these various combinations numerous times over the years. And so you can really actually, back to the point, you can really pull off a lot of Chaos and Aether damage combined if you go into these, and you focus on the Aether damage out of these as well. But it's something you can stop and think about for a bit, and see if you really want that. So there is that potential idea as well. So that's a fairly interesting time, but you could also just focus on that sweet physical damage, going into, obviously, Spectral Wrath, obviously Temper. Now, interestingly enough about Temper is that it will also increase the pierce damage of our good friend, the Bone Harvest, which is fairly interesting. Actually, for the most part, up to Dread at the very least, can be very effective, and if you're using a two-handed melee weapon, Harvester of Death is even more amazing, and furthermore adds even more elemental damage if you're going into that. That's entirely up to you. But again, this pulls weapon damage, so if you're careful about what weapon you're using, this can still benefit you quite a lot. You could either go with a physical, in which case you could convert all of that physical to cold, go with the Thermite Mine and have an absolute field day with that. Obviously increase Flame Touch and ignore Temper. Or you could go into Temper, not build this, and just kind of dedicate yourself here to the arts, so to speak. So, you have plenty of options. Now comes the question, should I pet? That's really... Pardon the yawn. that's really up to you. Can this work with pets? Yes and no. If you're going to be using pets, you are going to be looking for a hybrid build. You'll want Soul Harvest. You will want one of these two. Whether or not you go into Thermite Mine is up to you. If you're going to go into pets, I would recommend Thermite Mine, because if you're going into pets, you'll probably want skeletons, and you can increase their elemental damage. Now, again, the Blight Fiend is optional. The Wraith does Aether and Vitality Decay, so unless you're going into full-on Hellfire Mine, you could just manage a hybrid with the skeletons, go all the way up to the, the elemental damage, and then kind of roll with it from there. And then you can use Soul Harvest and bust out Granado and Canister Bomb, go with Flame Touched and increase your fire and lightning damage, and increase your, of course, your elemental damage across the board. That can absolutely work. Or again, you could go into Hellfire Mine, go into Brimstone, go into Blackwater Cocktail, and then you would theoretically potentially want to pick up the Reap Spirit, because it would be able to do even more damage with its Aether. So you have quite a few different options here if you really wanted to go about it. If you went about it the right way, there is a wrong and a right way of going about this, but without getting too much into items, this is all I can really say about the Defiler class. Will I be talking about this class more? Yes, because this is actually the episode I'm going to give you something of a sneak preview of what is next for this series after I'm done discussing these classes. Now, once I'm done discussing these combinations in a broad way, and what I'm basically covering here are various directed builds I've played over the course of my history with Grim Dawn. For reference, a directed improv is where you're taking what is essentially a rough concept of a build and building that way, and then just kind of picking up the equipment as you go that happens to match that particular improv. For example, I started a directed improv with a Demolitionist Occultist combination, and I decided that fire and chaos damage would be where I wanted to focus. I have since somewhat changed that up because of difficulties within the class itself, but I may return to my original idea as I get better equipment for it, and as I level up. But this right here is basically covering various directed improvs I've played around with over the years. What I'm going to do after I've covered all of these class combinations is I'm going to take individual items that I've done focused builds around and talk about how I build a focused build around that particular item and the kinds of things you want to consider when focusing on that item. And a focused build, I'll explain this better in a future video, but a focused build is essentially taking some level 90 plus piece of equipment and centering your build around that, its damage types, the skills it increases, etc. So that's what is in the future of this series after I'm done with all of these broad class ideas. And then if at any point, I'll remind you of this when I start the second phase of this series, but if at any point you're like, hey, can you, I don't know, do a run with this build and talk about this build and how you're building it and all that other delightful stuff, I can do that. Basically, I'll once I'm done with the current walkthrough of the second character, I'll probably either just decide to do a focused improv, I'll do a full improv, maybe I'll try a different directed improv. Once I'm done with this second character, I mean, basically what I play next will be on popular demand. Once I obviously finish the current walkthrough character of the Demolitionist Occultist. But once the Demo Occultist is done, once the Pyromancer is done, then I can do whatever combination you want. And as I, go through the combinations, I can actually just restructure according to need. But that is the plan for the future of this series, and I decided to address this here because I knew ahead of time that this particular video was going to be shorter, because again, I am kind of avoiding items with this class examination series so far, and I knew that this combination relied very heavily on items, more heavily than a lot of other combinations. This isn't something I would recommend you starting out. If you have characters that can either set aside equipment for this combination throughout its lifespan, or at least have the capacity to go out, wander around, and look for the items they need, then that's fine. But this is still a very item-intensive class. I have showed you some unusual and unorthodox ways of making it coordinate a little better, but at the end of the day, the items you get or have will make or break this combination more than any other class combination. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you all very much for joining me on this. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, or suggestions, please leave them down in the comments below. I do read them. And as always, have a great 24 hours.